Hello, everyone, and thank you for having us this evening. My name is Justin Bauer, and I am the head of product here at Amplitude.
And my name is Winnie Wong. I'm head of design.
There
So
we
today
go.
we wanted to share a story with you about how we use quantitative and qualitative data together in order to make product and design decisions. Spencer mentioned earlier in the opening statements about how we view qualitative and quantitative data as just collectively user feedback around the product. They each have their strengths. So quantitative is really great for measuring actions, frequency, volume. Like you said, every user has the ability to send you feedback through interacting with your application. And from a qualitative standpoint, it's really great for determining motive, context, perspective, emotion. It's the qualitative side of things that turns the numbers into a person and helps you build empathy for your user.
So what we'd like to do is take a step back in time to the not-so-distant past of 4 years ago. This is when Spencer, who kicked us off earlier this evening, and his co-founder, Curtis, founded Amplitude. And they founded it with a vision to disrupt the analytics industry by ensuring that anyone can get access to the data that they need to answer the questions that they have. And so they ended up building a product and quickly found product market fit with an early set of customers that were interested in getting very deep into understanding user behavior. And that ended up being a very specific type of profile. It actually was an ex-Zynga PM who left Zynga to found their own company or joined another company. Now, you might say that sounds pretty specific, but if you actually think about it, it kind of makes sense. 4 years ago, Zynga was a rather large company, innovative, and cared a ton about analytics. So they'd built out a series of analytical tools that PMs could use to answer any question they had. The problem was that once you left Zynga, you could no longer answer those questions. The different tools that were out in the market weren't capable of giving you the insights you needed until you found Amplitude. So this ended up being a great initial market for us as a company.
So like Justin said, ex-Zynga PMs turned CEOs. And it turns out, it's not a really deep analysis, but that's like 90 people, right? Which is great for Zynga. That's a lot of entrepreneurs to graduate out of your company. It's less great when in the whole world 90 people want your analytics product. But time passes, and customers are buying our product, which is wonderful. They're seeing value in it. And we get to a point where we are way past 90. At this point, we are very clearly out of ex-Zynga CEO PMs. And so what had happened really is that our customer definition had kind of slipped out from underneath us. Like, we could not claim that we knew our customer well anymore. So we needed to find out who our users were now. And luckily, since we are an analytics company, we were working on something in-house to identify patterns of user behavior in order to form personas. And so we were, of course, our first guinea pig.
That's right. So as Winnie mentioned, one of the great things about being in an analytics company is you get to actually build features that you can use to answer questions about your own users. And personas is definitely an example of that. Now, before I explain kind of what we're seeing here on the slide, I want to ask a quick question for the audience. How many people here are familiar with behavioral cohorts? Excellent, a fair number of you. So for those of you who aren't, a behavioral cohort is basically a collection of users defined by the actions that they do. So take, for an example, a group of users that added 7 friends within their first 10 days, to borrow from the famous Facebook study. So if a behavioral cohort is a group of users defined programmatically, think of personas as a group of users defined algorithmically, basically from your data. So we could actually analyze the data, and it would identify and partition different users into clusters based on those behaviors. So the example that we have here, we have a group of users that was actually identified through the algorithm based on the fact that they performed event segmentation and funnels, which are 2 analyses you can do in Amplitude, much more frequently than the average user. Now, the great thing about this is you don't need to understand k-means clustering or factoring, anything like that. Basically, you can work it out of the box. And so we pointed this at our own data, and we found some really interesting insights. We discovered that we actually had 5 distinct groups of kind of behaviors that are occurring within Amplitude. The first was a set of super users. They tended to use all the features within the product in addition to our very deep features like behavioral cohorting. The second was a group of power users that used a lot of features like event segmentation, like funnels, but didn't tend to use the more deeper features. The third was a completely separate group of users that really only used 2 features within our product, which was user timeline and real-time features, and didn't use any of the rest. The fourth was a more passive user, right, using dashboards, summary charts. And then the fifth was actually a non-logged-in user that was leveraging a feature we developed called shared links.
That answers the what, but it doesn't answer the why. And so for that, we needed to go into the field and ask our customers lots of questions. And so we did. We asked a lot of open-ended questions, things like, tell me about your analytics ecosystem. Tell me about the life cycle of your data. Tell me what you use the data for. Tell me about everybody who touches the product. And the answer that we found was great because it mapped back to the patterns of user behavior that we had found through our personas tool. So what you see is the four personas that we found. So in the case of the power user who's not using the deeper analytics features, but they are using it a lot, those turn out to be PMs. So I'm sure there's a lot of PMs in the house, but basically people who are responsible for a feature, an app, a suite of apps, and they're responsible for understanding if their app is doing well. And so they're checking it on a daily basis to make sure things are going well. Not surprisingly, we did have a group of, as Justin described, super users who are analysts and data scientists. They're doing a lot more exploratory work around like finding hidden gems within the data, insights that they can share with their company. And they're also very often identifying changes in KPIs on behalf of the PMs. Our third group primarily consumes analytics. So you have these at your company, it's the CEO, it's the VP, it's like a weekly meeting where the execs get together and review how the company is doing as a whole. Very often we heard stories of cross-functional teams as well, where they'd all get together and just to better understand how what they were doing was affecting the numbers. The fourth group is actually kind of interesting because when we asked people what their analytics ecosystem looked like, very often they would overlook this group of people. And so when they didn't mention, like, who are the people who are accessing the user streams, the user timelines? And when we asked that, they were like, oh, yes, that's right. So it's the engineers and the customer service reps would go in, and they would the engineers specifically would use it to confirm that instrumentation had been implemented correctly. They would also go in and reproduce bugs, right, because it was tracking an exact stream. Customer support, also using the tool for a similar reason, helping out a customer. You know, sometimes like they don't quite remember exactly what they did, and so you can go back and actually reproduce and help them solve their problem faster.
So why don't more companies do this? And the reason is because it takes a lot of time. Think about setting up different user testing. So think about creating a survey and making sure that the survey is going to work. Think about the market research that you're going to do, usability testing. These things can take 4 to 6 months or even longer. And the problem with that is by the time you get the insights back, they're no longer relevant. But what we have found is that by combining both quantitative and qualitative data together, we can fast track that process and go from 4 to 6 months to 4 to 6 weeks. Now, they claim that you can't have your cake and eat it too, but we don't believe that here at Amplitude. We believe that the combination of both spending less time can actually lead you to get stronger conviction around your decisions when you combine both of these things together through an iterative process that I'll walk through now. So this is a process that we use in product development here at Amplitude all the time. Many of you may have heard of it. It's called an OODA loop. So what is an OODA loop? So an OODA loop is a combination of observations, orientations, decisions, and action. Right? An observation is basically understanding what your users are doing. Right? You then orient around a hypothesis based on that observation, and ultimately make a decision and then act upon that decision. And in fact, our presentation today is just one of many OODA loops that we've gone through to get to the UI and UX redesigns that we'll show you later. To explain how that kind of works, I'll dive in a couple of these in more detail. So let's take the customer request example. So what we observed is that customers started asking for more business reporting features, which really didn't fit the profile of like the Zynga, XPM. And so we had a hypothesis that maybe sharing is something that matters more to our users. So we made a decision to build a couple kind of low-cost features to test that out and got that into production. We then observed a very high usage of those features compared to what we expected to see, which gave us the conviction to then go and do the persona work that we've walked you through. From that, we ultimately delivered and developed prototypes, tested those, and that's what has gotten us to the place we're at right now, which is the design and ultimately development of the new redesign.
So as far as how all this information impacted our decisions, we've certainly been working hard on the product, and we'd love to share it with you. We were given a big no-no by our head of marketing, like, no, we are not ready to share this. There's no announcements that will be made tonight. Forget about that. No. Yes, let's do it. You can't get a designer up on stage and not have them talk about their work. It's like physically impossible for us. So we wanted to share some of the key improvements that we wanted to make for the personas that we found. And one of them is actually related to today's theme of data access. So we very much wanted to make data self-serve, right? Get rid of that long line in front of the data science department. So one of the challenges of that is that the charts, when you see them out of context, don't necessarily make sense to the person who didn't create them. And so really simple things like, on the left, you'll see our current interface. On the right, like at the top, you'll see we've added a title, right? So the creator of the chart can actually communicate what this thing is trying to say. On the very bottom is an auto-generated summary of the contents of the chart in plain English. And in between, you'll see a reorganization of our query controls. So on the left, where we are currently, we actually have query controls across the top and on the side. And we received some feedback about how it wasn't really clear how all those things related. And so we grouped them all together at the top. This happens to be our event segmentation panel in the new design. On the far left is all of the events in the chart. In the center is the user segments, so it's all the people. And the third would be how you're measuring it. The other thing that we wanted to emphasize was just easier readability, right? So in zooming into those three panels that define the chart, we wanted it to be in as plain English as possible. So here we have, for each user that performed, right, from the following user segments and measured by uniques.
So next, for the consumer, right, the PM, maybe you're a PM of some insignificant augmented reality game that starts with a P, and you're trying to understand user behavior. One of the things that's really important to you is actually sharing insights with the rest of the organization. So we've really advanced our ability to share within Amplitude. One example is something that you can see here, which is the ability to unfurl URLs so that you can actually see charts within Slack. Right? We found that many of our customers use Slack as a means of communication, and so this is an easy way to share that with many people within the organization. We've also buffed up the ability to send out email reports. So anyone within an organization, you don't need to have a login to Amplitude, can get access to that, as well as the ability for any change you make to a chart to propagate to everyone who has access to that chart. In addition, the next use case is the monitoring use case. And so what we've done is a couple things. First, we really focused in on dashboards and really built out more dashboard features. So you can see the example of what dashboarding looked like on the left. That's the current product. And on the right is what it's going to look like when we release. And so things like the ability to change the size of a chart so you can dive in and see more information about it. The ability to pin and manage a list of your dashboards. Or the ability to easily subscribe to any dashboard that anyone has created. All those things are really critical to basically to this use case. And finally, on the next slide, we have browsing. So this is something that's really interesting. In fact, I thought it was interesting in one of the earlier panels that talked about kind of the dueling analyst, right? So what we want to make it is it's easy to actually find the chart that someone else has created, right? You don't necessarily have to go in and learn how to use all the features within Amplitude if you can access a chart that somebody else has created to answer the question that you have. So we've completely built out the ability to browse and save charts to address that use case. So in conclusion, we hope it was helpful to hear how we use data here at Amplitude to make better product and design decisions. If there is one thing that we'd love for everyone to take home with them, it's that product development is a very iterative process, but if you can combine both quantitative and qualitative insights together, you can actually reduce the time to insight while having stronger convictions around the decisions that you're making. Now, if anyone has any questions for us, I think we'll have a couple minutes. In addition, we're actually going to be over there in the back showcasing the new app. So if you want to see an example of what we've shown up here, or just in general, we can answer any questions that you have. But with that, maybe we'll take a couple questions.
Sorry, so I'm always curious about how do people actually work across cross-functional teams. So I always find that the data is kind of refining the engine almost into that lean startup mechanism, but how do you get into the hypothesis generation? Where do you go from, when you're talking about personas and archetypes, how do you bring the designers and the product people to say, I understand we don't have the data for this yet, but I'm trying to translate that qualitative insight that I believe that we've found, and then we need to make an experiment that we can then measure, and then we can prove that to the business owners in order to say that this was of value. Because it seems like if you're just measuring what you've already built, rather than really thinking about what your hypothesis is, you're only going to make optimizations rather than big leaps. And I was curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so I completely agree. And I think those OODA loops are examples of kind of how I think about product development in that mind. If you're just thinking about optimization, you're never going to get that next leap. And so a big thing that we do around qualitative insights, using your own intuition, kind of there's a lot of different sources of insight to think about kind of what the next big thing could be. And then what I like to do is basically think about a couple smaller features that you can build that give you that conviction, right? So the example that we shared here around a lot of the new design that we did, like, yeah, none of that was specifically directly from our data that told us to do this. But we had a couple features that we built that if we saw customers using them, indicated that that's the right direction to go, right? So that was how the data told us that that's where we should go, right? And then from the usability studies, from all the qualitative work that we did, we used that in combination to kind of push the envelope, right, to ultimately deliver what we've shown here today.
Yeah, I might add that from my perspective in running a design team, my attitude is always, like, I'm very impatient, right? Like these like tiny iterative improvements are just like drive me bonkers. And I'd much rather test like the cheapest but most extreme implementation of an idea first. Because if it doesn't work when it's turned up to 11, it's not going to work ever, right? So I'd rather, often when we're brainstorming about how we're going to test that, how we're going to see if that's true, those will be the designs that we end up showing. And that's true in a qualitative sense as well, is that when you go in, like sometimes you're testing the exact design, but sometimes you're just trying to learn and get a reaction. And in those scenarios, it makes a lot of sense to show the user a very polarizing design as opposed to a safe one, just so you learn.
As a little follow-up, what's the size of your design organization compared to, say, the engineering side?
Oh, we're huge. We're two. We are two people. Tarek, where are you? I love you, man.
Yes, hi. So I'm a product manager and sort of also struggling with the question of how do we come up with the personas, right? There are a lot of guesses, like you said, a lot of qualitative analysis that goes into sort of guessing which events or which steps would the user take to ultimately arrive at a certain persona or be sort of grouped into persona. Do you have any tips in how to take those best guesses before you build your analysis?
I don't know. So that's hard to answer. I mean, I feel like we had a starting place with our existing customers. And I think the key to going in and getting as much information as you can is to really ask extremely open-ended questions. And it is a difficult skill to learn to not lead the witness, So very open Socratic questions and digging in, and to basically not stop asking questions until you understand why, right? Dig out all the who's and dig out all the whys. And so, often like the other questions that we would ask are like, you can't go in with any assumptions like we're the only analytics tool they use, or what are, what are they using? How often are they using it? Like any of these things, like you can assume nothing. And so I kind of feel like this is going to sound really cheesy, but if you kind of go in with like a very open heart as to like genuinely wanting to understand the world that that person lives in, it's a really, really good start. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Justin.
Yeah, I think the open mind is probably the most important thing, right? Otherwise, you're going to define them in the way that you think they are, and then you're just going to create personas that have no impact on the business. So I've seen that tons of times, where you do all this work and you end up getting nothing new, and so no change happens. And so having that open mind, and that's why the data is really critical to that. Now, maybe you don't have access to something that can do like a full clustering analysis, but even looking at individual user data and just seeing like a stream of users and what they're doing can sometimes generate insights into like, why would a user do that in sequence, right? And while that's qualitative, it's kind of pushing the edge of like, what are users doing? So you start questioning that, and that may lead to something that you can then test through different kind of persona and different usability studies, and ultimately maybe lead you towards something new that you had never thought of in terms of usage in your application.
So when going through the OODA loop in general, how do you balance the intuition or gut with data?
Yeah, so the gut is a really important, so if you think of the data, that's kind of the observation. The gut is the orientation, right? So you're going to interpret that data, and so you may have a hypothesis that you've set, right? And then you want to see, does the data validate that hypothesis or not, right? And that hypothesis should be from your gut, right? You have an intuition there. Take advantage of that. Don't ignore your intuition. But the other thing is, be honest, right? If the data doesn't prove out your hypothesis, don't hold on to it, right? That's the importance. If you just ignore it and you only look for data that proves the things that you are pushing, your agenda, right? Then you're really not, you might as well not even look at your data to begin with. So have intuition, but make sure the data actually confirms that, right? And try to do it as fast as possible. That's the really important thing. So OODA is something that like fighter pilots talk about all the time. And they say like the key to winning a dogfight is literally just going through the OODA loop faster than your competition, right? So have a hypothesis, quickly test it, observe, act, move on to the next thing. The faster you can do that, the better off you'll be. Well, thanks everyone. Appreciate the time.
Thank you so much for your time.